This is my go-to Italian style sandwich made on the best sourdough focaccia. Now I'm going to show you guys exactly how we did it so that you can make it yourself at home. Let's get started. Now, before we can actually bake our bread, we need yeast to work with. And because we're making a sourdough focaccia, which is, in my opinion, the superior focaccia, it means we need a mother yeast. So the way that we're going to do that is a jar, a measuring cup, a knife, and some flour, and some water. So all we actually need to do is literally go 1 part flour. So let's go 1/4 cup of flour to begin with, whack it into the jar. And then I'm going to fill this up. To start the sourdough, I'm going to go equal parts. So I'll go 1 cup of flour, 1 cup of water, 1/4 cups. Give it a good mix up. And then we just want to loosely reattach our lid. It doesn't need to be super tight because fermentation is going to kick off and start taking place, but you don't want it so loose that bugs and stuff can get in there. That's really all you're aiming for. So I'm just going to kind of loosely pop that on top. I'm going to let that sit for 1 day. Now, in 1 day's time, I'm going to come back once again and I'm going to add another 1/4 cup of flour. And this time I might go 1.5 parts of water just to kind of make it a little bit more liquidy and make it a little easier for the yeasties to kind of get going. That's all you have to do. It's rinse and repeat from here on out. You're going to repeat this 4 to 5 days. By that point, you're going to have a very bubbly, frothy looking focaccia. Frothy looking starter that's gonna make a focaccia, and it's gonna look something like this. So this is the yeast starter that we prepared a little bit earlier. And if I open the lid up and let you have a look inside, you'll see it's got some nice bubbles going on. It's got some good yeast activity. This one is slightly lethargic and asleep, so it's time that we feed it today and make some bread. After that, you can keep your yeast starters alive for years. This one over here, I have had alive for about 6 years now. And all you have to do to keep these things going is replace it with as much flour and water as what you took out of it. That's it. That's your yeast starter in a nutshell. It's not more complicated than that. Now, just before we actually make this dough, I thought it'd be worth explaining where the yeast actually comes from. The vast majority of it is actually sitting in your flour. So natural grains already have natural yeasts and other fungi and bacteria coated all over them. It's called wild yeasts and wild cultures. So all you're really doing here is giving it the means to actually activate and start munching the sugars that it's sitting on top of. So there's already yeast in this bag. It's already coated all through this flour. All we need to do is give it a little bit of a helping hand. That's pretty much it. That's where the yeast comes from, and that's how you get your starter. Now we can make some bread. Now, for this particular recipe and based on my baking tray size, I'm going to be going with 3 level scoops of 1 cups of flour. And then I'm going to go 1 cup of yeast starter or mother culture or whatever you actually want to call it. And number 3, alrighty. Now, let's do our pour of our mother yeast. Easy done. And now for the water. I like to run at a 70% hydration. If you're new to baking, what that basically means is how much water versus flour ratio you're running with. In this case, I'm doing 3 cups of flour and 2 cups of water. That gives me 70% hydration. I find that gives you the best balance of having a very, very fluffy focaccia, as well as one that still has a little bit of structural integrity to it. I've seen people do 100% hydrations and it's very impressive. I'm not there yet, so I'm gonna run with 70%. Now, I do need a paddle or a spoon of some description. All we're gonna do now is mix this all up together. So we will add salt, but we're gonna add that salt a little bit later. What we want now is for all this dough to be nice and sticky and goopy and loose so it's easy enough to mix. And then once we add the salt in about half an hour from now, that's gonna help the dough start to tighten up and make it easier to work with and easier to knead. So right now, all we need to do is make sure that this gets mixed up enough that there's no loose water, there's no loose powder. It's just a nice kind of sludge, so to speak, of dough. What I'm actually gonna do is add a little bit more water. I'd like mine to be a little softer than this. So, and that's the other thing, you can kind of adjust this as you go. Do what works for you. You don't need to follow any of these ingredients or these ratios exactly. You will kind of find what makes your best flour and what makes your best dough. And what we now have is kind of a big, thick, sort of sticky paste. This is what you want your dough to look like. Now, what we're gonna do here is now that we've fully mixed everything, we don't have any dry balls or dough balls or anything like that going on, we are happy to let this rest for a bit. So I like to just kind of scrape the sides down and into itself to just kind of get all the dough out of it that I can. Beautiful. Now, we're gonna cover this. I like to just use a tea towel and wrap it over and under the bowl, leave it covered for about half an hour. At that point, we're gonna come back and add 2 teaspoons of salt, mix it through again, and then we can start the fun part, our stretch and folds. It's now been about half an hour, so it is time to add a little bit of salt. I'm gonna go 2 teaspoons sprinkled over the top of this bad boy. Then we're gonna give it all a nice big mix up. Now, the purpose of the salt here isn't just for flavoring, it's also because it actually helps the tension and the strength of the dough itself. It helps it all tighten up a bit, which is gonna assist us when we start getting to our stretch and folds. So once again, just mix this in like it's a big bowl of batter. Make sure it's nice and thoroughly mixed so you get an even spread of salt throughout all of the dough. And then, and look at that, the instant difference, because as soon as that salt goes in, it just starts tightening up all the dough. And suddenly you can start to see this as more than just a sludge, and it actually starts to become the dough that we're gonna turn into our bread. So I'm gonna let this rest again for probably about 15 minutes, and then we're gonna start our first set of stretch and folds. Cover it up until then, and we'll see you in a minute. Okay, it is now time for our first set of stretch and folds, which is the actual fun part of bread making. So have a little water bowl or something to dip your fingers in, make them nice and wet so that you can tuck them under the dough here, dig your fingers underneath, pull it up, stretch, fold over. Needed a bit more water than that, to be honest. Again, similar deal, rotate the bowl by 90 degrees, stretch, fold over. Once again, rotate, stretch, fold over, and we're gonna do that until we've gone around the clock. So until we've done 4 sets, well, 4 stretch and folds, which makes 1 set of stretch and folds. Now, once again, we are going to cover this up, leave it for about another 15 minutes to half an hour, depending on how impatient you are, and then we're gonna repeat that a couple more times. That's stretch and fold set number 1 finished. Let's aim for 4 of these, and then we're gonna whack this into the container to ferment overnight. Okay, we are now ready for our last set of stretch and folds, but just before we do that, we're gonna prep our container. So just get a little bit of olive oil, give it a good healthy glug in there, and then just use your fingers to spread it around. You basically are just doing this to prevent the dough from sticking to any of the plastic, because we are gonna do a couple more folds called coil folds once they're in here, and we are good to go. All right. Last set of stretch and folds, and you can see how much more dough strength we built up now. So the whole purpose behind the stretch and folds is you're building the gluten network inside the bread. So that's basically the thing that gives it structure, so that when you do bake it, it actually has structural integrity and strength to it, so it can rise upwards instead of just blooping and spreading outwards. So that gluten network is super, super important. Sorry for those of you that are gluten-free. Now let's pop this whole thing into our container. I like to use a container that's at least twice as big as what the original dough is, because this thing is going to expand a lot by the time it finishes fermenting. Now, I'm going to let this rest for a little while, maybe about half an hour or so. Then I'm going to do my first set of coil folds. So I'll show you how to do that shortly. Okay, coil folds. It's now been about half an hour since the last one. Now, the coil folds are a much more delicate way of treating the dough, so you can use these as the fermentation progresses. You could do some now, but you could also let this rise for a few hours and do some more coil folds later. So you scoop it up from the middle, let it drop under its own gravity into 2 spots there like that, and then drop it over itself like a big coil. Now, you could do, say, maybe 3 or 4 more of these coil folds. I might let this actually just rest for a while and let fermentation take its place, let this thing start to rise, and you can use those coil folds to keep building more dough strength even once you're in the primary fermentation phase of this bread dough. So it allows you to make it even fluffier, even more structurally strong, and even tastier. That is it for this for now. I'm gonna let this thing ferment overnight, and then we'll start baking our actual focaccia. Now, to save us all a little bit of time, we are gonna use some dough that we prepared earlier. So this is one that we made yesterday and we left out to sit overnight to rise and get nice and fluffy. So it's now bursting at the seams of this very large container, which is awesome. So let's oil up our baking tray and get started, shall we? Now, I like to do a half generous little drizzle on the bottom here. And then don't be afraid to get your hands nice and oily because it's going to help you to maneuver the dough onto the pan afterwards anyway. Now, you can use ceramic trays and glass trays. I've seen people use all kinds of stuff. Just keep in mind, if you use a non-stick tray, it just means that it's going to be a little bit easier for you to actually get the bread off afterwards without using just insane amounts of oil. So if you want to use a little bit less oil, go with a non-stick tray like this one here. All right, we're all good there. Now to plop out the dough. Oh, look at how bubbly and fluffy that's looking. That is exactly how you want it to look. Now, the same way as we did our stretch and folds, just make sure you wet your fingers a little bit to help you actually maneuver the dough onto the tray itself. And let's just plop it out here, nice and easy. Oh, so fluffy. That is freaking awesome. That is going to be a delicious focaccia. Absolutely beautiful. Now, there's a couple different techniques you could use here. You could fold the dough over onto itself if you want to really make it really high and fluffy. I think this one is already quite bubbly on its own, so I'm happy to leave it just as is. But what we do want to do is start heating up the oven and use that time to let the dough rest now that we moved it around and degassed it a little bit. So the 20 minutes it takes for the oven to heat up is about enough time for this stuff to rest before we actually start baking it. So I'm gonna get that started and then we'll come back to you when we're ready to actually bake this thing. All right, our oven is almost at temperature, so it's time to do our toppings. The bread has rested long enough. Now I'm gonna show you a little trick that I like to use a bit less oil when I'm baking my focaccia. If you're happy with super drenched focaccias, that's fine. Just go and drizzle the oil right on top and start smushing it. But I like mine to be a little bit lighter. I find it sits a bit heavy in my stomach if it's too oil heavy. So I like to go a little bit of water into a jug, then drizzle my oil into there. I also don't mind using a little bit of chili oil. Now I'm actually running out of the oil in this chili, but I'm just gonna scoop out some of these flakes and throw them in. Give this thing a nice mix. And now, because we've mixed this with water, water and oil don't mix, but if you just give it a quick blitz, what it does allow you to do is just pour it a little more easily over the top of your bread, so then you can mix it around a little bit more comfortably without having to use just an absolute ton of oil. All right, now we give it a good mix across the top. And the other side kicker is, as this sits in the oven, that water is gonna evaporate with the heat. So it's not even gonna be soggy by the end of this. By the end, you're still gonna have a crispy focaccia. Then you're gonna have some nice bubbles and everything going on, but you haven't had to use a whole ton of oil to get there. Now, here's the fun part, the part that you see on all the Instagram reels. Make sure your fingers are nice and wet, a little bit oily, and then you get to finger the dough. Nice. Oh, that part's always so satisfying. It's my favorite part of the focaccia baking. All right, I'm gonna quickly clean off my fingers. We're gonna do a little bit of cracked sea salt over the top of this bad boy, and then we are ready to get baking. Now, you could use flaked salts if you have them. I don't have any on hand at the moment, but flake salts are great because you've got those slightly larger clumps that like to sit and dissolve into the bread. But I'm just gonna go with a bit of cracked salt over the top. Just a light layer. You do you. If you like it to be extra salty, go for another round. But that is our focaccia ready to bake. So let's get this thing in the oven. Alrighty, and into the oven we go. So I've got this preheated to 220 degrees, fan forced. Pop the oven in, close her up. And now we are gonna let this bake for 23 minutes, but remember at about the 15-minute mark to come in and just twist it the other way around so that it's not getting the full brunt on one side of the bread. 23 minutes is my guide, but cook until golden brown or however dark you like your focaccia to be. So let's get the time lapse going and then we'll come back to you when we're ready to slice this thing up. And we're ready. It's time to get baked. So let's get our focaccia out of the oven. Oh, that is looking absolutely gorgeous. You could be fancy and use a spatula, but I don't mind a bit of a pancake flip, so voila. And there we have it. Now I'm gonna slide this back onto the grill a little bit. Don't get too greedy too fast. Let this thing rest for at least 5 minutes. Just give it a moment. It's still gonna be hot, but if you just cut into it straight away, you're gonna collapse all the fresh gluten networks and everything that have just been baked inside there, and you're gonna get a kind of a soggy, dense dough. So let this rest for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll start slicing up and having a little taste of this beautiful, fluffy focaccia. I forgot, it's, you know, social media and stuff, so I gotta do the... Hang on, can you get the mic in? Beautiful. It's so beautiful, and it's now time to finally cut ourselves a slice. So I'm gonna shuffle this off the end of our cooling racks. Oh, hell yes, that's just so nice. Now look at that beautiful fluffiness inside. And this is why you wanna be very thorough with your stretch and folds and your coil folds. So you get this beautiful gluten network in here, and that's what makes it so damn fluffy. Look at that squishiness. So this is exactly what you want to make a beautiful sandwich. This is now my favorite sandwich bread in the world. And I'm gonna be a little bit gross, but it's just me here, so let's take a bite. It's so good. It's so fluffy, it's amazing. Now that we've got our awesome sourdough focaccia, let's talk about how we made this sandwich. You can do this however you want, but my style is a layer of fresh avocado, fresh pesto, of course. The kicker is a little bit of beetroot relish for that extra zip, extra tang, then tons of fresh rocket, buffalo mozzarella, and of course the piece de resistance, the Italian mortadella. So cheers for watching, guys, and enjoy making this yourselves at home. So good.